The handcuffs were already out when I opened my front door that Tuesday morning, and the woman standing behind the two police officers had the most satisfied smile I'd ever seen. Karen Hutchinson had finally done it. She'd managed to get me arrested on my own property for doing the job I'd been trained for, licensed for, and paid by the federal government to do for the past 18 years. What she didn't know, what none of them knew as they read me my rights in front of my neighbors, was that the badge in my wallet carried more authority than her entire HOA board combined. And when the truth came out, that smug smile would be the last thing Karen Hutchinson ever directed at me.my name is Marcus Webb, and I've spent most of my adult life in the woods. Not as a hobby or weekend escape, but as a career. For 18 years, I've been a federal game warden with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, responsible for protecting wildlife and enforcing conservation laws across 3 counties in rural Montana. It's not the kind of job that makes you rich or famous, but it's honest work that matters. Every poached deer I prevent, every illegal trap I confiscate, every habitat violation I document, it all adds up to something bigger than myself. It adds up to preserving the natural world for generations who haven't been born yet. When my wife Elena died in a car accident 3 years ago, that work became even more important to me. The silence of the forest, the responsibility of protection, the simple clarity of right and wrong in a world that suddenly felt chaotic and unfair, it was the only thing that kept me anchored to sanity during those first horrible months of grief. After Elena's funeral, I made a decision that changed everything. I sold our house in town and bought 47 acres of mixed forest and meadowland, about 15 miles outside Whitefish. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to heal, to do my job more effectively, and to honor Elena's memory by protecting the wilderness she'd loved as much as I did. The property was perfect for my needs. Dense pine and fir forests provided habitat for deer, elk, and black bear. A clear stream ran through the eastern boundary, supporting trout and providing water for wildlife. The terrain was varied enough to serve as a training ground for the conservation education programs I ran for local schools and hunting groups. But most importantly, it was quiet. No traffic, no city noise, no reminders of the life Elena and I had planned to share in our suburban house with its manicured lawn and white picket fence. Just the sounds of wind in the trees, water over rocks, and the occasional call of a loon from the small lake that bordered my property to the north. I thought I'd found my sanctuary. I had no idea I'd actually moved next door to my worst nightmare. The Pine Ridge Heights Homeowners Association wasn't something I'd paid much attention to when I bought the property. The development was relatively new, maybe 5 years old, and consisted of about 30 large homes built around the southern shore of Pine Lake. My property predated the development by decades, and according to my deed and survey, I wasn't part of their association. That technicality became very important later, but at first, I was just grateful for the distance between my cabin and their neighborhood. I could see some of their houses through the trees, and occasionally I'd hear kids playing by the lake or adults having barbecues, but for the most part, we coexisted peacefully. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a welcome basket. I was cleaning my service rifle on the front porch standard maintenance that every game warden performs regularly when a bright red BMW pulled up my gravel driveway. Out stepped a woman in her early 50s, perfectly dressed despite the rural setting, carrying what looked like a gift basket covered in cellophane and ribbons. "You must be our new neighbor," she said, climbing the porch steps with the kind of confident smile that immediately put me on guard. "I'm Karen Hutchinson, president of the Pine Ridge Heights Homeowners Association." I set down my cleaning kit and stood up, noting how her eyes fixed on the rifle with obvious disapproval. "Marcus Webb. Nice to meet you." She handed me the basket, which I could see contained local honey, some homemade cookies, and a thick folder labeled Community Guidelines and Regulations. "We're so excited to welcome you to our community," she continued. "I have to say, it's refreshing to see someone taking an interest in this old property. It's been neglected for far too long." Neglected? I looked around at the pristine forest, the well-maintained cabin, the carefully managed wildlife habitat. "I think it's in pretty good shape." Her smile tightened slightly. "Well, I'm sure you'll want to bring it up to community standards. There's so much potential here for landscaping. Maybe a nice lawn area, some decorative fencing." The thought of turning 47 acres of wildlife habitat into suburban lawn made my stomach turn, but I tried to stay diplomatic. "I prefer the natural look. Better for the local ecosystem." "Oh, I'm sure you do. But you'll find our community values consistency and property values. Speaking of which," she gestured toward my rifle, "I hope you're not planning to do any hunting on the property. We have strict noise ordinances, and frankly, firearms make some of our residents nervous." I felt my jaw tighten. "Ma'am, this is my property, and hunting is legal in this county. I'm also a federal game warden, so firearms are part of my job." Her eyebrows shot up. "A game warden? Ow, interesting. Well, legal and appropriate are two different things, don't you think? We have children in the neighborhood, families who moved here for peace and quiet. Hunting is quiet when it's done properly. And it's necessary for wildlife management." Wildlife management. She said it like the words tasted bad. "Mr. Webb, I think you'll find that our community has moved beyond that kind of rustic lifestyle. We're trying to build something special here, something family-friendly and safe." I could see where this conversation was heading, and I didn't like it. "Mrs. Hutchinson, I appreciate the welcome basket, but I should clarify something. According to my survey, my property predates your development and isn't part of your HOA." The smile disappeared entirely. "I think you'll find that's not quite accurate. The county records show that all properties within a half-mile radius of Pine Lake are subject to our conservation and community standards agreements." "Conservation standards?" I couldn't hide my incredulity. "You just told me to tear up natural habitat and plant lawn." "Mr. Webb, I can see you're going to need some time to review our community guidelines. I'm sure once you understand what we're trying to accomplish here, you'll be more than happy to cooperate." She turned to leave, then paused at the top of the porch steps. "Oh, and Mr. Webb, you might want to be more careful about where you clean your weapons. Some of our residents have been concerned about what they've seen from your property." After she drove away, I sat back down with my rifle and tried to process what had just happened. Karen Hutchinson had managed to make a welcome visit feel like a threat, and she'd done it with the kind of polished aggression that suggested she'd had plenty of practice. I opened the folder she'd left and started reading through the community guidelines and regulations. What I found made my blood run cold. According to Karen's version of reality, every property within what she called the Pine Ridge Heights Conservation Zone was subject to a comprehensive set of rules that would have made suburban HOAs look permissive. No hunting, no firearms discharge, no disruptive wildlife management activities, no structures that weren't pre-approved by the architectural committee, and no land use changes without environmental impact studies. The regulations were 47 pages long and covered everything from acceptable paint colors to approved plant species. At the bottom of the last page, in small print, was a note that violations could result in fines up to $500 per day until corrected. I called the county clerk's office the next morning to verify my property status. After 20 minutes on hold and another 20 minutes explaining my situation, I finally reached someone who could pull the relevant records. "Mr. Webb, your property is definitely not part of any homeowners association," the clerk confirmed. "The deed is clear and there are no recorded covenants or restrictions beyond standard county zoning. Where did you get the idea that you might be subject to HOA rules? I told her about Karen's visit and the regulations folder. Sir, that sounds like someone is trying to intimidate you with fake authority. You might want to consult with a property attorney if this continues. I thanked her and hung up, feeling both relieved and concerned. Karen Hutchinson was either confused about her actual authority, or she was deliberately trying to intimidate me into compliance with rules that didn't legally apply to me. Either way, I had the feeling this wasn't over. That weekend, I decided to do some routine wildlife surveying on the eastern boundary of my property. It was standard conservation work checking trail cameras, documenting deer populations, looking for signs of poaching or habitat disturbance. I was in full uniform, carrying my service weapon and official identification, doing exactly the job the federal government paid me to do. I was kneeling next to a game trail, examining some unusual tracks, when I heard voices coming through the trees. "There he is," a woman's voice said. "Just like I told you." I looked up to see Karen Hutchinson approaching with two other people, a man in his 60s wearing golf clothes and a younger woman with a tablet and camera. "Mr. Webb?" Karen called out in a voice loud enough to carry across the forest. "What exactly are you doing on private property with that weapon?" I stood up slowly, making sure my badge was visible. "Ma'am, this is my property, and I'm conducting wildlife surveys as part of my duties as a federal game warden." "Your duties?" The man in golf clothes stepped forward. "I'm Robert Hutchinson, Karen's husband and vice president of the HOA. We've reviewed the regulations, and what you're doing violates multiple community standards. Sir, I'm not part of your HOA, and even if I was, federal law enforcement duties supersede local regulations." The woman with the tablet started typing furiously. "Are you claiming federal agents are exempt from community safety standards?" "I'm claiming that I have the legal authority to perform conservation work on my own property." Karen's smile was back, but it was colder now. "Mr. Webb, I think you're confused about your actual authority here. Federal agent or not, you're still subject to local noise ordinances, safety regulations, and community standards. And frankly, your behavior has been increasingly concerning to our residents." "What behavior?" "Armed patrols of the forest, surveillance activities, setting up monitoring equipment without community notification." She gestured toward my trail camera. "How do we know you're not using that to spy on our children when they're playing by the lake?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "Ma'am, those are wildlife cameras for conservation research. They're focused on game trails, not on your neighborhood." "So you say. But how are we supposed to verify that? How do we know what you're really doing out here with those weapons and cameras?" I realized that Karen wasn't interested in truth or clarification. She was building a narrative, creating a record of confrontation that she could use later. The woman with the tablet was documenting everything, probably preparing some kind of complaint or report. "Mrs. Hutchinson, if you have concerns about federal law enforcement activities, you're welcome to contact my supervisor at the Fish and Wildlife Service. I can give you the number." "Oh, we'll be making calls, Mr. Webb." "Don't worry about that." They walked away, leaving me standing in my own forest, feeling like I'd just been accused of crimes I couldn't even identify. But as I watched them go, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. They weren't walking back toward their neighborhood. They were walking toward the county road, and Karen was already on her phone. That evening, I got a call from my supervisor, District Chief Janet Morrison. "Marcus, I just had an interesting conversation with someone from your local HOA. They're claiming you've been using federal resources for personal activities and intimidating local residents." "Chief, that's completely false. I was doing routine wildlife surveys on my own property, in uniform, following all standard protocols. I figured as much, but I want you to document everything from now on. If these people are going to make formal complaints, we need a paper trail showing exactly what you were doing and why." "Yes, ma'am. But Chief, I think there's something bigger going on here. This isn't just neighbor harassment. They're trying to establish some kind of authority over my property that they don't legally have. Marcus, you've been doing this job long enough to know that some people think their local politics override federal law. Handle it professionally, document everything, and don't give them any ammunition to use against you." After I hung up, I sat on my porch looking out at the forest and wondering how my quiet refuge had become a battlefield. Karen Hutchinson had made it clear that she wasn't going to accept my presence or my work, and she was willing to involve federal agencies to make her point. But what worried me most wasn't her complaints or her fake regulations. What worried me was the look in her eyes when she'd suggested I might be spying on children. That wasn't just neighbor harassment. That was character assassination, and it suggested Karen was willing to destroy my reputation and career to get what she wanted. I just couldn't figure out what that was, or how far she was willing to go to get it. The answer came sooner than I expected, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. The harassment campaign began the next Monday with surgical precision. Karen Hutchinson had apparently spent the weekend mobilizing her resources, and she launched a coordinated attack that caught me completely off guard. It started with the mail. I found the first letter slipped under my door that morning, not mailed, but hand-delivered sometime during the night. The letterhead read Pine Ridge Heights Community Safety Committee and was signed by Karen as Director of Community Protection. "Dear Mr. Webb," it began. "Following multiple resident complaints regarding unsafe firearms activities, unauthorized surveillance operations, and failure to comply with community conservation standards, you are hereby notified that your property is under formal review for potential safety violations. Continued noncompliance may result in escalating enforcement actions, including involvement of county authorities and federal oversight agencies." The letter went on to demand that I cease all armed activities on my property, remove all surveillance equipment, and submit to a comprehensive property safety inspection within 14 days. At the bottom, in smaller print, failure to comply with this notice may result in daily fines of $500 as authorized under emergency community safety protocols. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling more angry and confused. Emergency protocols? Community Safety Committee? These people were making up authority they didn't have and using official-sounding language to intimidate me into compliance. But Karen wasn't done. Over the next week, I received similar letters from the Environmental Protection Committee, the Wildlife Management Oversight Board, and the Firearms Safety Compliance Division. Each one demanded different actions, threatened different consequences, and claimed different authorities. The most disturbing was the letter from something called the Child Safety Monitoring Group, which suggested that my surveillance activities posed potential risks to minor children and demanded that I provide detailed documentation of all monitoring equipment locations and purposes. They were building a file, creating a paper trail that made me look like a dangerous rogue agent operating outside proper oversight. And they were doing it with enough official-looking documentation that someone reviewing the case later might actually take their claims seriously. But the letters were just the beginning. On Wednesday, I discovered that someone had been on my property during the night. Not just walking around actually tampering with my equipment. 2 of my trail cameras had been moved, repositioned, so they were pointing toward the HOA neighborhood instead of the wildlife areas I was monitoring. The implications were terrifying. If those cameras had actually been recording the neighborhood, it would have looked exactly like the surveillance activities Karen was accusing me of. Anyone reviewing the footage would see cameras pointed at homes instead of game trails, and they'd conclude that I was indeed spying on families. I immediately repositioned the cameras and changed the access codes, but the damage was done. Karen now had photographs showing surveillance equipment pointed at her neighborhood regardless of who had actually aimed them that way. Thursday brought a visit from the county's zoning inspector. Mr. Webb? I'm Dale Patterson from County Zoning. We've received complaints about unpermitted structures and land use violations on your property. I invited him in and offered coffee, trying to stay cooperative despite my growing frustration. Dale, I haven't built any structures. The cabin was here when I bought the property, and it's all properly permitted. Well, that's not exactly what we're hearing. The complaint mentions unauthorized wildlife blinds, hunting platforms, and surveillance installations. I walked him around the property, showing him each item Karen had complained about. The unauthorized wildlife blind was a small observation shelter I'd built for the school groups I brought out for conservation education. The hunting platform was a standard tree stand that was completely legal on private property. The surveillance installations were my trail cameras, clearly marked with official fish and wildlife service tags. Dale was professional and thorough, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. On paper, Karen's complaints probably sounded serious. In reality, everything on my property was legal, properly managed, and clearly related to legitimate conservation work. Mr. Webb, I have to ask, are you having some kind of dispute with your neighbors? You could say that. The HOA president seems to think she has authority over my property, even though I'm not part of their association. Dale made notes in his file. Well, everything here looks legitimate to me. I'll file a report clearing these complaints, but, sir, in my experience, when someone files this many detailed complaints, they're usually building up to something bigger. You might want to be prepared for that. He was right. Friday morning brought the something bigger in the form of 3 vehicles pulling up my driveway, a county sheriff's patrol car, a white SUV with Department of Natural Resources on the side, and Karen's red BMW. I watched from my porch as Karen got out of her car, carrying what looked like a presentation folder, and walked directly to the officers before they'd even approached my door. Mr. Webb? The sheriff's deputy was young, probably new to the job, and he looked uncomfortable. I'm Deputy Collins. We've received some serious complaints about illegal hunting activities on your property. Illegal hunting activities? Ma'am here says you've been conducting unlicensed hunting operations, possibly commercial guides or training without proper permits. I looked at Karen, who was standing behind the officers, with that same satisfied smile she'd worn at our first meeting. Officers, I'm a federal game warden. I don't need licenses for wildlife management on my own property, and I'm not running any commercial operations. The Natural Resources officer stepped forward. Sir, I'm Officer Bradley. We understand you're employed by Fish and Wildlife, but that doesn't give you unlimited authority to conduct hunting activities outside federal oversight. What hunting activities? I haven't hunted anything on this property. Karen opened her folder and handed a thick stack of papers to Officer Bradley. I have documentation of multiple firearms, discharges, evidence of animal kills, and photographs of illegal hunting platforms and bait stations. My blood ran cold. Karen had been building a case against me with fabricated evidence, just like she'd done with the moved trail cameras. But this was worse. She was accusing me of violating federal hunting regulations, which could cost me my job and my freedom. Officers, I'd like to see this documentation. Officer Bradley flipped through the papers, his expression growing more serious. Mr. Webb, these are pretty detailed allegations. Photos of what appears to be evidence of kills, recordings of gunshots, witness statements from multiple neighbors. None of that is accurate. I haven't discharged a weapon on this property except for routine maintenance, and I haven't killed any animals. So you're saying these photographs are faked? I looked at the photos Karen had provided. They showed areas of my property I recognized, but with evidence of hunting activities that definitely hadn't happened. Gut piles that weren't there when I'd walked those areas. Blood trails that led to locations I'd never been. Equipment that wasn't mine positioned to look like illegal bait stations. Someone had been on my property, not just moving cameras, but actually creating crime scenes, planting evidence of illegal hunting activities and photographing them as proof of my violations. Officers, someone has been trespassing on my property and planting this evidence. Those kill sites aren't real, or if they are, someone else created them. Karen shook her head sadly. Officer, this is exactly what I was afraid of. Mr. Webb has been increasingly paranoid and aggressive since we asked him to comply with basic community safety standards. Now he's claiming that evidence of his own activities was somehow planted by neighbors. Ma'am, are you alleging that Mr. Webb has been threatening or intimidating residents? Not directly, but his behavior has been very concerning. Armed patrols of the property line, surveillance cameras pointed at our homes, angry confrontations when we've tried to address safety concerns. Several families have children who are afraid to play near the lake anymore. The lies were so smooth, so detailed, that I could see the officers believing them. Karen had turned my legitimate conservation work into evidence of criminal activity and my attempts to defend myself into proof of mental instability. Mr. Webb, Deputy Collins said, we're going to need you to come with us to answer some questions. This is getting serious enough that we need a formal statement from you. Am I under arrest? Not at this time, but we do need to investigate these allegations thoroughly. I spent the next 6 hours at the county jail, not in a cell, but in an interrogation room, answering question after question about activities I hadn't engaged in and evidence I'd never seen before. The most frustrating part was that the more I insisted the evidence was planted, the more paranoid and defensive I sounded. Officer Bradley was professional but clearly skeptical. Mr. Webb, you're asking us to believe that your neighbor has been conducting an elaborate frame-up operation involving trespassing, evidence planting, and fabrication of multiple witness statements. That's a pretty serious accusation. It's a pretty serious situation. Officer, I've been a federal game warden for 18 years. My record is spotless. Why would I suddenly start violating the exact laws I've spent my career enforcing? People change, sir. Stress, personal problems, sometimes federal employees think their authority gives them more freedom than it actually does. Check with my supervisor. Check my service record. Check the dates on these alleged violations against my work schedule. I can prove where I was during most of these incidents. That finally got their attention. Over the next 2 hours, they verified my work schedule, called my supervisor, and cross-referenced the dates Karen had provided with my official duties. What they found was interesting. Most of Karen's evidence was dated on days when I was either at federal training sessions or working in different counties entirely. The photographs she'd provided as proof of my illegal activities were taken when I wasn't even on my property. Mr. Webb, Officer Bradley said as he came back into the interview room, your alibi checks out for most of these dates. But that raises some disturbing questions about who was actually on your property creating this evidence. I told you someone was planting it. Yes, but we're talking about multiple trespassing incidents, creation of fake crime scenes, and a coordinated campaign to frame a federal officer. That's not neighbor harassment, that's multiple felonies. I felt a mix of relief and growing anger. Officer, what happens now? Now we investigate Mrs. Hutchinson as thoroughly as we investigated you. When I finally got home that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, I found another letter under my door. This one was different, shorter, more direct, and much more threatening. Mr. Webb, your refusal to cooperate with community safety standards has forced us to take more serious action. Federal authorities have been contacted regarding your activities, and formal complaints have been filed with your employment supervisors. Additionally, Child Protective Services has been notified about potential risks to local minors. If you do not cease all firearms activities and remove all surveillance equipment within 48 hours, we will be forced to pursue all available legal remedies. This is your final warning. The letter was signed by Karen, but this time she'd added a new title, Director of Federal Oversight Compliance. I sat on my porch that night, looking out at the forest that had once been my sanctuary, and realized that Karen Hutchinson wasn't just trying to control my property or drive me away. She was trying to destroy my career, my reputation, and potentially my freedom with a campaign of false accusations and planted evidence. But she'd made one crucial mistake. By involving federal agencies and filing false reports about a federal officer, she'd elevated her harassment campaign into federal crimes. And unlike local HOA disputes or neighbor complaints, federal crimes got investigated by people who knew how to recognize fabricated evidence and coordinated fraud. I called my supervisor and requested an immediate meeting. It was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back with the full authority of my federal badge. But as I was making that call, I noticed a car parked on the county road with a clear view of my property. As I watched, the car's window rolled down and something that looked suspiciously like a telephoto lens was pointed in my direction. Karen wasn't done with me yet, and whatever she was planning next, she was documenting everything to support her next round of false accusations. The war for my property, my career, and my freedom was about to escalate beyond anything I could have imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my neighbor's teenage son. Tommy Chen lived with his parents in one of the newer homes on the far side of the lake, and he'd always been fascinated by wildlife. Over the past year, he'd started stopping by my property after school to learn about animal tracking and conservation. His parents appreciated that he was spending time outdoors instead of playing video games, and I enjoyed sharing my knowledge with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. Tommy was the kind of kid who noticed everything: the way deer moved through the forest, the patterns of bird migration, the subtle signs that most people missed entirely. Which is why I should have expected him to notice the things Karen Hutchinson was doing when she thought no one was watching. He knocked on my door the Sunday evening after my interrogation at the county jail, looking nervous and excited at the same time. "Mr. Webb, I need to show you something, but you have to promise not to tell anyone I was watching." "Tommy, what's wrong?" "It's about Mrs. Hutchinson. The stuff she's been saying about you isn't true, and I can prove it." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a video file. "I've been practicing my wildlife photography in the woods behind our house. You know, trying to get better at staying hidden and patient like you taught me. Last Tuesday night, I was set up near the old oak tree trying to film the family of raccoons that lives there. The video was dark and a little shaky, clearly shot by someone trying to stay concealed, but the image was clear enough. It showed Karen Hutchinson and two other people I didn't recognize moving through the forest on my property, carrying bags and what looked like photography equipment." "Tommy, when was this taken?" "Tuesday night, around 11 p.m. But that's not the crazy part. Watch what they do." The video continued, showing Karen's team systematically placing objects around my property. Not just moving my trail cameras like I'd suspected, but actually creating fake evidence of hunting activities. They scattered deer bones that they'd brought with them, poured what looked like animal blood in strategic locations, and set up illegal-looking bait stations with my property markers clearly visible in the background. "Jesus," I whispered. "It gets worse," Tommy said, scrolling to another video. "This was Thursday morning, right before those officers came to your house." The second video showed Karen photographing the evidence she'd planted 2 nights earlier, but now she was taking pictures in daylight with official-looking equipment. She was literally creating the documentation she'd later present to law enforcement as proof of my illegal activities. Tommy, this is incredible. How long have you been filming this? About 3 weeks. I started because I heard my parents talking about the complaints Mrs. Hutchinson was making, and I knew they weren't true based on what I'd seen when I was over here. So I figured maybe I could catch her doing something suspicious. Have you shown this to anyone else? No, sir. I wanted to show you first because I know you're one of the good guys, and what she's doing isn't right. I looked at this 15-year-old kid who had just handed me the evidence that could save my career and expose Karen's criminal conspiracy, and I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with concern for his safety. Tommy, what you've captured here is evidence of multiple felonies: trespassing, evidence tampering, filing false reports, conspiracy to frame a federal officer. This is serious stuff. I know. That's why I've been scared to show anyone. Mrs. Hutchinson has been telling people that anyone who supports you is probably involved in whatever she thinks you're doing. That explained why some of my neighbors had been avoiding me lately. Karen hadn't just been attacking me directly, she'd been poisoning the entire community against me with her false accusations and implied threats. Tommy, I need to ask you something important. Are you willing to share this evidence with law enforcement? Because if you are, it could put you and your family in an uncomfortable position with the HOA. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the forest where he'd spent so many hours learning about the natural world I'd dedicated my life to protecting. Mr. Webb, my dad always taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right. And what Mrs. Hutchinson is doing to you, it's not just wrong, it's evil. I called Officer Bradley that night and arranged to meet him the next morning. When I showed him Tommy's videos, I watched his expression change from professional skepticism to genuine shock. Mr. Webb, this is unbelievable. She's not just harassing you, she's conducting a sophisticated frame-up operation. Officer, I want to press charges: trespassing, evidence tampering, filing false reports, conspiracy to interfere with federal law enforcement. Throw the book at her. We will, but first we need to document everything properly. I want you to walk us through your property and show us every location where evidence was planted. We'll need photographs, measurements, witness statements. This is going to be a big case. There's something else, I said. I think Karen's motivation isn't just neighbor harassment. I think she's trying to force me to sell my property. I told him about the development inquiries I'd received over the past year and how several of them had mentioned combining lakefront properties for larger projects. If she could drive me out with harassment or get me arrested and forced to sell to pay legal fees, she could acquire my land for development. 47 acres of lakefront property is worth a fortune if you can get it rezoned for commercial use. Officer Bradley made notes. We'll look into her business connections and any development interests she might have. But Mr. Webb, what we have here is enough for multiple felony charges. Even if we never prove a financial motive, she's going to prison for what she's already done. That afternoon, I called my supervisor and arranged a conference call with a regional director and the federal prosecutor's office. When they heard about the evidence tampering and false reports involving a federal officer, the response was swift and decisive. Marcus, Regional Director Sarah Martinez, said, "We're going to handle this at the federal level. Evidence tampering and conspiracy to interfere with federal law enforcement are serious federal crimes. We'll coordinate with local authorities, but this case is going to be prosecuted in federal court." What does that mean for me in the meantime? It means you're back on full duty, effective immediately. And we're going to make it very clear to your local community that any interference with your legitimate conservation work will be treated as obstruction of federal law enforcement. Ma'am, there's one more thing. I think Mrs. Hutchinson has been coordinating with other residents to build community support for her complaints. Some of my neighbors have been avoiding me, and I think they've been told I'm dangerous. We'll address that too. We're going to hold a community meeting to explain your role, your authority, and the federal investigation into the false complaints against you. It's time to set the record straight. Wednesday evening, I stood before 35 residents of the Pine Ridge Heights community in their own community center, flanked by 2 federal investigators and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The mood in the room was tense and confused. Most of these people had been told for weeks that I was a dangerous rogue agent operating outside proper oversight. Now they were hearing from federal officials that I was the victim of an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Ladies and gentlemen, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh began, we're here tonight to address some serious misconduct that has affected your community and interfered with legitimate federal law enforcement activities. She outlined the charges being filed against Karen Hutchinson, multiple counts of trespassing, evidence tampering, filing false reports, and conspiracy to interfere with federal law enforcement. Each count carried potential prison time and substantial fines. Mrs. Hutchinson has been engaged in a systematic campaign to frame a federal officer through planted evidence, fabricated documentation, and coordinated false reporting. This is not a neighbor dispute or HOA conflict. These are serious federal crimes. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. I could see people looking at each other with confusion and embarrassment, realizing they'd been manipulated into supporting a criminal conspiracy. What about the HOA rules? Someone called out, the community standards she was trying to enforce? There are no such rules, the federal investigator explained. Mr. Webb's property is not part of your HOA, and even if it was, homeowner association bylaws cannot supersede federal law enforcement activities. Mrs. Hutchinson had no authority to regulate Mr. Webb's legitimate conservation work.